Hello, you're listening to Finding a Founder, the podcast where we uncover Benjamin Franklin's role in American independence and his legacy in the cities of Boston, Philadelphia, and London. We are just over the halfway point in the series, and this week we find ourselves talking to another famous Philadelphia-based institution founded by Franklin. I'm your host, Henry Wilkinson, and in today's episode, I'm joined by Michelle McDonald, who is director of the Library and Museum for the American Philosophical Society. Together, we're going to be talking about a number of topics relating to the society, including its founding, the impact of the American Revolution on the organization, and its role in the 21st century. We're also going to discuss Benjamin Franklin, the philosopher and scientist, his relationship with slavery and eventual abolitionism, his role in the Stamp Act of 1765, and other contemporaries such as Thomas Paine and their contribution to American independence as well. It's going to be a jam-packed episode. So without further ado, Michelle, hello.
Hello, Henry. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure having you. So Michelle, tell us, what is the American Philosophical Society?
The American Philosophical Society is the oldest learned society in the United States. It was founded in 1743 by Benjamin Franklin, along with John Bartram. The latter was a farmer and self-taught botanist. And their goal, which is part of our mission statement still today, was to promote useful knowledge. It now operates as a membership organization, a research library, and a public museum.
Brilliant. So the society, just briefly for today's audience, the society it's split over several different sites. I understand that there's a library, a museum. How big is this organization today?
We have 4 buildings in our campus. The original building is from 1789. That's Philosophical Hall, and it now houses our museum and administrative suite. Library Hall, which is where I'm talking to you today, is our research library and our research centers. And then just about a block away, we have 2 other buildings. Franklin Hall is our conference center. It holds about 350 people, as well as our conservation lab. And Richardson Hall next door holds our research fellows, education department, and museum staff.
And you're located in central Philadelphia, is that right, near the National Park?
We are located in the heart of Old City, Philadelphia, right next door to Independence Hall, and across the street from the Liberty Bell.
So you mentioned that the current building is from 1789, but Franklin founded the society in 1743. How did it operate during Franklin's time in the city?
So when it was founded in 1743, it didn't have a permanent home, and they met on a regular basis, usually monthly for the first several years, and so they would move from location to location, usually in people's homes, and so it was definitely a well-functioning society, but it didn't have a permanent presence until after 1789, and so it was very much a place of ideas until it had a home where it could begin collecting and storing the beginnings of what we think of as our library collection today.
And do we know where the first ever meeting took place? I'm presuming it would have been in Franklin's own home, but do we know where exactly that meeting would have happened?
That's a really excellent question, and we don't. Franklin's home was definitely the site of several meetings, and it's located only 2 blocks away from where we are. But it didn't have, again, it was this sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? It was a free range philosophical society until about 40 years into its existence.
And for those first 40 years, how large was the organization in terms of membership? Was it just a couple of people meeting every month, or did it grow and grow until they had to build a hall to actually meet in?
It grew significantly. So it started actually with a fairly large corpus of members, most of them in and around Philadelphia, but not all of them. And that's what sets the American Philosophical Society apart from Franklin's earlier organization, the Junto, which was very much Philadelphia based. So it started with a handful of members, but grew relatively quickly, partly because what Franklin envisioned for the American Philosophical Society was to make it on par with the Royal Society of London. So his goal for the society was always to be bigger than a local institution, even bigger than a regional institution. He wanted this to be an international institution, which it was before the American Revolution began.
And you mentioned there that prior to the American Philosophical Society, there was an organization that Franklin called his Junto, which was perhaps a more a slightly smaller organization, more personal to Franklin and his inner circle. I wonder if you could explain what exactly Franklin's junto was and how did it work?
So Franklin's junto, he founded in 1727 for friends to be able to improve themselves through what he called a community of discussion of morals, politics, and natural philosophy. It had 12 members that represented various trades in and around Philadelphia, and they had a pledge, which I thought was interesting. So anyone who wanted to become a member of the junto was first asked if they were a lover of truth. If they answered yes, the next three questions that they had to pledge to do was not to disrespect one another, not to disrespect persons based on their profession or religion, and not to condone violence against anyone in, quote, his body, name, or goods for mere speculative opinions or his external way of worship. This, in many ways, even this early on, he's mimicking what John Locke had devised as his own rules of society, which also met once a week for the improvement of useful knowledge. This was his model when he thought of the junto.
So these 12 members of his junto, they were different trades, potentially different religions, but I imagine when they met, how did the meeting take place? What did Franklin model his junto after? You mentioned John Locke, but was there any other influences on how each meeting actually ran?
Sure. The meeting met weekly. Again, it was supposed to be a group for self-improvement. And part of what I liked about this organization is that they had to actually offer certain things for discussion. So you were required, all members, and these include artisans, printers, tradesmen, they were required to pose questions. They were required to read an essay of their own creation to the club every 3 months. So there was homework if you were a member of the junto. And they were pledged to support ideas of self-improvement, although this very quickly translated into ideas of community improvement. So some of the civic projects that were initially discussed in the junto and for which Franklin is known are ideas for a fire company, for an insurance company, for a local militia and town watch. All of these were very early ideas in the 1720s and 1730s, even before the American Philosophical Society was founded.
That's great. And we heard all about the founding of the fire company and some of the other civic organizations that Franklin organized during his time in Philadelphia in our previous episode. But coming back to the junto, how did somebody become a member of Franklin's new philosophical society?
Some of the members of the junto became members of the American Philosophical Society. Others became deeply invested in other offshoots of that organization. Really, I think it's fair to say there were three primary outcomes of the junto, or three organizations here in Philadelphia who trace our roots back. In addition to the American Philosophical Society, you have, as you mentioned, the University of Pennsylvania, and you also have the Library Company of Philadelphia. So, and they weren't exclusive. Someone could both be a member of the Library Company and a member of the American Philosophical Society, but you see junto members really becoming invested in and helping to support the development of these three organizations. But his aspirations for the American Philosophical Society were on a grander stage than what he had planned for the junto. Really, the APS, as I said, the junto was a local organization focused on community betterment. The American Philosophical Society was intended to be an international organization that helped to put America's scientists and thinkers on a global stage.
And I think we can agree he was very successful in that, because here we are talking about it 250 plus years later. And you also mentioned the Library Company, who we'll be hearing from in our next episode. So it'd be good to hear what they make of all this, and maybe they can tell us about some other joint members. But staying with the APS and the members from this period, as well as Benjamin Franklin, can you tell us if there are any other well-known or famous former members of the society?
Pretty much anyone who was anyone in early America was a member of the American Philosophical Society. So members included doctors and lawyers, but also clergy and merchants, and included George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson. In fact, I will say that when Thomas Jefferson was the president of the American Philosophical Society, he was also the president of the United States at the same time. But there's also luminaries like Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Paine. We'll come back to him when we discuss the impact of the American Revolution on the APS. leading medical authorities like Benjamin Rush, James Madison, but also international figures. So the Marquis de Lafayette, Baron von Steuben, and Thaddeus Kosciuszko were all members of the APS during the 18th century.
And how would the international members be members of the society? Would they be required to attend a meeting, or could they do it sort of
remotely?
Yeah, but how could an international member do it from overseas?
So excellent question. So I will acknowledge that the three men I just mentioned were in North America for broad periods of time. So they were actually able to attend APS meetings in person, but you could be a correspondence member. And I would be remiss, I'm moving a little bit forward in time, but I would be remiss not to mention that this was the case for the first woman who was elected to membership at the American Philosophical Society. Her name was Princess Romanova Dashkova. She was a Russian noblewoman. She never attended an APS meeting in person, but she was a major figure in the Russian Enlightenment and a close friend of Catherine the Great and ultimately of Benjamin Franklin. She also was the first woman in the world to head a National Academy of Sciences. She became the president of the Russian Academy, and she published prolifically. And it was for those reasons that he ultimately decided to nominate her for membership, the only woman who was a member of the society for well over a century.
And so it was Franklin himself who recommended her membership. And I presume they corresponded with each other. Do we know if they ever met face to face?
I don't know if they met face to face. I do know that they corresponded with each other. And that is, you asked earlier, how did someone become a membership? This is a good example. Someone had to be nominated for membership from existing members in order to be considered for inclusion within the American Philosophical Society. And that tradition actually continues to this day.
And just briefly for the people listening, how many members are there today?
There's roughly 1,000 members of the APS today, maybe 850 or so. I think 4/5 are located within the United States and 1/5 are located abroad. Several are located in the UK.
And then back in the 18th century, how many are we talking about in the first couple of decades after it's founded?
There you're really talking in the dozens. It doesn't become this kind of really large organization until later in the 19th century. But in the 18th century, we're talking dozens of people that span all 13 British North American colonies. That was one of the reasons, I mean, partly because Benjamin Franklin lived here. But the other reason they selected Philadelphia is they thought it was equidistant among the 13 colonies, and so would encourage more people to meet in person. Because while they did establish correspondence networks, it was important to them that there also be face-to-face meetings to discuss anything from political theories to recent developments in natural philosophy, or what we would call science today.
I think this brings us quite nicely onto talking about what actually happened at these meetings. And you mentioned science was at the forefront of a lot of them. What sort of, especially when Franklin was there, what would be going on in these meetings? What were the topics of the day that you can think of?
So they ranged broadly, and nicely for us, they began publishing proceedings of the meetings of the American Philosophical Society, and then ultimately a journal now known as Transactions, which I believe is the longest running publication within North America. They established their own press. And so we can look back at these meetings and see exactly what they were discussing. They discussed everything from electrical experiments to forms of appropriate government to new ways of combating agricultural dilemmas. The invasion of the Hessian fly and its impact on wheat, for example, was a very strong conversation. But one of the experiments that put the APS really on that global stage that Franklin wanted was in 1769, when the American Philosophical Society participated in a global effort to track the transit of Venus across the sun. And at APS, we chose David Rittenhouse, who was a clockmaker, repairer, but also a self-taught astronomer, to be the person to devise those calculations. And he partnered with people literally around the globe to try to get a very accurate measurement of how long it took Venus to cross the sun. And the reason why they were looking at different perspectives is their goal was to create what is now known as the astronomical unit, or the definitive distance between the Earth and the sun. And it was that series of calculations that were then published in 1716, after 1769, where the APS became known as a center for important learning. and began to have a meaningful exchange with other learned societies around the country. These were men and one woman. These were men who were really interested in science, not just for science sake, but science as a way to improve the standard of living. So from the outset, if you look at the 1743 document that outlines Franklin's ideas, Franklin and Bartram's ideas for the APS, this is about how science can be used to improve transportation, to understand waterways, to elevate agriculture, but even things like viticulture and brewing of beer, creation of vegetable juices, design of new mechanics for new sorts of printing presses or carriages. They were very much about science as an applied mechanism for community.
So Benjamin Franklin, he founds the American Philosophical Society in 1743 and I presume becomes its first president.
He is, yes.
How long did Franklin serve in that role? Because obviously Franklin, he makes a move to London in 1757, effectively stays there until 1775. From 1743, how long does Franklin serve as the president and how long is he an active member in the city as part of this society?
So there's a two-part answer to that question. Franklin was the initial president of the American Philosophical Society for a few years. And then interestingly enough, I will say for the first few years is when the society is most active. In 1769, to re-galvanize the APS, Franklin becomes its president again, and he holds that position until he dies in 1790, which means that Benjamin Franklin is the president of the American Philosophical Society, even when he is not in Philadelphia.
And so does that have an impact on how members are able to join the society? Is he the person giving sort of the last tick before they can become members, or will there be people in Philadelphia welcoming new people in his absence?
Definitely, he's not, well, he's part of the process, but I would say it's less hierarchical than the last tick. There is a voting of members, but it's a collective vote within the membership to elect new members. So even if Franklin is abroad, that doesn't mean that the APS cannot continue to function. It functions, again, as I said, somewhat erratically until 1769, and then there's a regalvanization. I will say there is a lull during the American Revolutionary period for reasons that we can discuss. And then it restarts again when Franklin returns to Philadelphia after his time as an ambassador in France until 1790. And thereafter, the institution runs extremely strong under new membership through the 19th and into the 20th and now 21st centuries.
So Franklin, he's president of the Philosophical Society. Let's focus a bit more on Franklin himself. What were some of his big philosophical ideas? And let's not forget as well that during this period, philosophy and science are often intertwined with each other.
You're absolutely right. In fact, as far as we know, Benjamin Franklin never referred to himself as a scientist. He would have thought of himself as a natural philosopher. And this influenced the kinds of experiments that he was interested in. So his interests were very wide-ranging, covered all different types of fields. One of Franklin's early inventions was nature printing. So this is a technique of trying to capture botanical specimens as accurately as possible. He begins this collaboration with a friend of his named Joseph Brentnall, who was also a member of the Junto and a member of the library company. And their goal was twofold. One was to try to capture plants as precisely as they could through printing methods. And so they developed their own printing press specifically for these kinds of very careful scaled replications. He brought examples of these to the American Philosophical Society to show them how lifelike they could be, but they served a second purpose, which is they were much more durable than trying to send actual physical plant specimens either to different colonies or even further abroad to other nations. And I do want to suggest, though, that Franklin, he is always thinking about the next step ahead. For him, this also became a way of thinking about how to print currency, which seems like a bit of a leap, but what he would do is take specific plants, leaves, flowers, and replicate them on paper currency And to do that, he would use this particular printing press, but it also created a way by which you could tell actual currency from counterfeit currency. And that's really what he was trying to forestall. He became so good at it that he received government contracts actually to print money within the colonies.
And does this lead to paper money becoming more decorative?
It does become more decorative. It was much more functional before, and as a result, it was easier to create copies. And so what he was trying to do was create a way by which people would have more confidence in paper money, which was becoming increasingly important even before the American Revolution. That's one of the reasons why the colonists respond to the Currency Act, which requires that colonists pay their debts to Britain in hard currency, which was scarce. And so paper money was a way of trying to create a more fluid system for economic activity. But in order for it to work, the currency had to have value. So Franklin was creating a way of bolstering colonists' confidence in the paper currency that they were circulating.
Franklin, ever the polymath that keeps on giving. As well as his work in botany and advocating for the use of paper money, he was also a very well-known scientist in the field of electricity. I wonder if you could tell us about some of the electrical experiments he conducted in Philadelphia.
So Franklin is probably best associated with his experiments in electricity among all of the experiments and innovations that he had a hand in. He began experimenting with electricity when a man named Peter Collinson sent to the library company an article from Gentleman's Magazine, which was being circulated in England, that explained experiments that were happening in Europe. I should add that Collinson also sent a glass tube, which could be used for generating static electricity. So Franklin began performing experiments around the city. He did them for the American Philosophical Society, but he also advocated public experiments because he wanted to get the common man and woman involved in understanding what electricity was, how it could be harnessed, how it could be made more safe. So he created a contraption using insulated glass jars. They were called Leyden jars to store electrical charges, essentially creating a battery by connecting a series of these jars and designing experiments that proved that electricity could be conducted safely. This, of course, is really critical in understanding how to harness power, but it's not the electrical experiment I suspect you were referring to. The one he's best known for is his experimentation with a kite and a key. And this was something he did with his son, William. And his goal there was not just to demonstrate electricity within a confined or a man-made environment, but to demonstrate that even something as spectacular as lightning could be harnessed for a productive rather than a destructive purpose. So the goal with the key up on the string was to determine whether or not lightning could be conducted, whether it would be attracted to particular materials. And metal was the conduit that he was testing. When he determined that relationship, he took those ideas and applied them to what became lightning rods, which he advocated for every public building and even private buildings in Philadelphia. He had one installed in his own home, which was just a couple of blocks away from where I am currently sitting. And the goal was, again, to create a place where you could predict where lightning would strike as opposed to a random lightning strike, which could have devastating consequences.
And when Franklin comes to London, he also installs Europe's very first lightning rod on St. Paul's Cathedral, which I believe has been protected from lightning ever since, having burnt down 3 times prior to Franklin's arrival. You mentioned Peter Collinson sending Franklin new information, equipment to carry out experiments with. I wonder if you could tell us about any of these new ideas that perhaps also influenced Franklin. We often say that he's one of the key thinkers of the Enlightenment. I wonder if there were any of Franklin's beliefs or ideas that were influenced or even changed by these thinkers that he came into contact with.
Probably the best example I could give you is Benjamin Franklin's relationship to ideas involving slavery. They changed dramatically over the course of his lifetime. And the place of slavery, the morality of slavery, is very much caught up in transatlantic Enlightenment correspondence networks and thought circles. So like many of his contemporaries, Franklin did own enslaved people, which he employed in his printing business. And that, of course, helped him to accumulate his own personal wealth, but he also contributed to the industry by selling enslaved people for others and even by accepting them as payment for debt. And his newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, published advertisements for the sale of enslaved people, as well, of course, as the bounties that were issued to encourage the capture of those who ran away from slavery, trying to enact their own emancipation. But partly influenced by abolitionists that he met when he was in England, and by other conversations with those he had in France, Franklin became a leading figure ultimately in the Pennsylvania abolition movement. Indeed, he became the president of the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery. He advocated repeatedly for the end of slavery in essays. He corresponded with other abolitionists like Anthony Benezet, and he even supported public education for formerly enslaved people. In 1790, which was the year he died, he presented a petition to Congress on behalf of the Abolitionist Society, which urged the federal government to find ways to, and these are his words, remove the inconsistency from the character of the American people by ending slavery. In other words, how can we claim to be a nation based on ideas of freedom and independence when slavery persists? And while he was successful in many of his political endeavors, he was not, as we know, successful in this one, at least not at that time.
So Franklin was influenced by circles in Britain as well as France, but do you think it's also safe to say, or fair to say, that the American Revolution, as well as these French and British circles, also sort of had a very reflective impact on Franklin?
I think it's very fair to say that. I think that he's an extremely intelligent man, right? And more than one person is pointing out that the core rhetoric of the American Revolution is about freedom. It's about rights. It's about equality. And it's hard to take that language and lay it side by side with a system, an economic system that is still based on chattel bondage. And he recognized that inconsistency. He recognized that incongruity. And I think that is absolutely what influenced his increasingly abolitionist stance later in life.
So we mentioned the American Revolution. Franklin is obviously absent for large periods of the Revolutionary War. He's in London, he's in Paris. But what about the American Philosophical Society? What happens in the build-up as well as the war itself? What happens to APS in this period?
It is admittedly a very challenging time for the American Philosophical Society for a host of reasons. First of all, the American Philosophical Society's, some of its leading luminaries, people like Washington and Jefferson, are increasingly embracing the revolutionary cause. And then, of course, another key member is Thomas Paine, whose publication in 1776 of Common Sense becomes a galvanizing force. It becomes the revolutionary rhetoric that is embraced by those who are seeking independence. Not all members of the APS, however, were patriots. Some of them, like Joseph Galloway, notably, were loyalists. And so trying to bring together increasingly fractured political opinions within the APS was difficult. If you add to that, in 1777 and in 1778, Philadelphia is occupied by the British. And so meetings of organizations like the American Philosophical Society would have been seen as suspect. And so the American Revolution is a period of, I don't want to say decline, but it's a period of a lull in APS's regular meeting activity and its members, just given, again, the disparate nature of membership and their political affiliations. It would have been hard to come together.
And there are a few things I would like to focus in on in what you just said. The first being that there's this sense of division. Would members be cast out for their political beliefs, or did the society continue to function despite people perhaps having a loyalist leaning or a more patriotic at this time stance?
I don't have any records of anyone being ejected from the American Philosophical Society. And so I don't think that they necessarily took that stance when it came to their membership. I just think it became increasingly hard for them to be in the same room with each other, because these became, we often talk in the United States about the Civil War being a war of brother against brother, but the American Revolution was too. It was a war that divided families. It was a war that divided neighbors. And so it was a war that candidly divided members within the American Philosophical Society as well.
A person you mentioned that I also wanted to talk about was Thomas Paine, who we know a lot about here at Benjamin Franklin House, because Paine is a British citizen who becomes American, largely thanks to Franklin's reference that he writes, allowing Paine to emigrate and move to the colonies. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about his journey when he eventually arrives in Philadelphia in 1775. How quickly does he become a member, and what sort of things does he get up to when he is in the city?
So he does not become a member of the American Philosophical Society until 1785, but he is meeting with and sharing his ideas with the APS much earlier than that. So Thomas Paine, again, becomes affiliated with some of the leading members here of the APS, and his 1776 publication of Common Sense sweeps not only through Philadelphia or Pennsylvania, but sweeps throughout the colony. It becomes a textbook, really, for what people think a government owes its citizens and what recourse citizens have when a government is no longer fulfilling, in their mind, its obligations.
A lot of people have probably heard of Common Sense, but don't truly understand the impact that it had. How did so many people come to hear Paine's argument? How did Common Sense spread across the colonies like it did?
It spread through broad-based printing. So Common Sense is advertised in newspapers starting in 1776, in multiple newspapers. You can find it tracking throughout all of the 13 colonies. So it is picked up by publishers, and because it is popular, it is reprinted over and over and over again. And because Paine chose to write in the kind of accessible language that he did, it was something that many people could read. And those who couldn't read, right, those who weren't literate, could still learn about Paine's ideas in public readings that were held in places like taverns and in coffee houses.
You mentioned coffee houses, a very important part of 18th century society, both in North America and also in Great Britain as well, in the UK. What exactly is a coffee house, and why is it an important centre for learned conversation?
So you've hit on one of my favorite topics. Coffee house culture is something that I studied for a long period of time. Coffee houses, both in 17th century England and in 18th century North America, are places of political debate and discussion, but they are also, and this is important to remember, they're places of business. So coffee houses in the colonies fulfilled many of the functions of what become discrete industries in the 19th century. So banking, they held international currency days, insurance, particularly maritime insurance for men involved in transatlantic trade, postal services, newspaper subscriptions, and libraries. They'd spend hundreds of pounds on newspapers from around the world so that residents could keep in touch with current trends, with shipping news, with news about hurricanes or other natural disasters that might influence the market. As a result, it's not surprising that coffee houses become sites of colonial discontent. When you think about, for example, the Stamp Act, which is passed in 1765, which levies a stamp tax on all stamped paper, newspapers, business forms, customs papers, really anything, receipts that have to do with business activity, it really makes sense that those who are going to be most directly affected, including many members of the American Philosophical Society, would choose to meet and discuss their reaction in coffee houses. And the best example I have is William Bradford's coffee house, which was called the Old London. And William Bradford was also a member of the American Philosophical Society and was a printer like Benjamin Franklin. He was a primary agitator in bringing together people to discuss what should be done about the Stamp Act, to encourage the creation of a non-importation agreement to ban basically colonies from importing goods from the British Empire as a way of gaining economic leverage. And he is where one of the best examples of political protest for Philadelphia anyway take place, and Franklin was involved.
And so you mentioned the Stamp Act, a key moment in the build-up to the American Revolution, something that Franklin was directly involved in, something that I would say he perhaps misjudged. I wonder if perhaps you could first tell us briefly what the Stamp Act is, the impact it had on everyday Philadelphians, and perhaps the outcome of Franklin's misjudgment during this period.
Sure. The Stamp Act was It was a tax, and it was required on all American colonial paper documents, legal documents, newspapers, even playing cards. And in theory, it wasn't a bad idea. Britain had just ended its colonial endeavors in the 7 Years' War. It had defended the colonies against the French. It was deeply in debt, and it was asking the colonies to pay a portion of that debt. That being said, what colonists most objected to, well, they did object to the tax, but what they also objected to was the idea that Parliament had the right to tax without their political participation, right? That really was the crux of the issue. Where did the colonies fit within the British Empire, as colonists or as citizens? And so the Stamp Act to them undermined colonial political authority, and their reaction was to impose in most of the colonies a non-importation agreement that first banned goods from Britain itself and ultimately banned goods from anywhere in the British Empire. It did result in the Stamp Act being repealed.
But not before Franklin, who, as a printer himself, should perhaps have been more aware of the day-to-day impact of the Stamp Act. He didn't really anticipate the reaction that there would be in Philadelphia. I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about some of the errors that he made before it was repealed.
Sure. So Franklin, and I should say he was not alone. Franklin in 1765 had not fully embraced the idea of North American independence yet. He was still hoping that what we could do is to ensure our position within the British Empire as full citizens. And the great example of that is he is involved in selecting the man, someone named John Hughes, who is to become Philadelphia's stamp collector. It is on Franklin's recommendation that Hughes takes this post. The challenge, of course, is that when Hughes arrives in Philadelphia, he did not understand the level of resistance that he was going to meet. So he is first met by a number of Philadelphia leading luminaries, including William Bradford, and told that the Stamp Act is not going to be abided by, and that he should relieve his post. He doesn't do so, but when his commission and the stamped paper actually arrive, another group, again mobilized by Bradford and others, meet at the old London Coffee House and wend their way through the street to John Hughes's residence, where they threaten both his person and his property. At that point, he does relinquish his post. And the reason we know this is that we have a collection of some of John Hughes' papers here at the American Philosophical Society, and they include a letter that was written to him by two British emissaries who had come to the Philadelphia area asking where they could purchase stamped paper. And Hughes' response is, "Have you not heard what's going on in Philadelphia?" And then lays out this full discussion about the unrest in the city, and in particular the role of the coffee house in creating activity and pushback against the Stamp Act.
And like you said, eventually it is repealed. This is a big moment in the whole no taxation without representation, I suppose, line of argument. Benjamin Franklin, though, he's in London during this and does play a role in in the act being repealed. But it's eventually leads to the American Revolutionary War. And you mentioned earlier that the city of Philadelphia was eventually occupied in 1777. But of course, before that, we have the signing of the Declaration of Independence. What happens with the society during this period, from the signing through to the occupation? And then when does the society go back to normal?
So the period of the actual revolution itself is a challenging one for the society, partly because, again, there is so much political division within the city. Imagine, if you will, in 1776, all right, the Declaration is drafted and then declared, and then the revolutionary government that is in charge begins asking all of its residents to sign an oath of allegiance to the revolutionary cause. Not all do. There's a really well-known case here in Philadelphia of several Quaker businessmen, leaders, families who had been part of the Philadelphia political system for generations, being arrested with no formal accusation, no trial, no method of appeal, and being exiled to Virginia. And even appeals from their wives to George Washington do not affect their release. In 1777, the British then occupy Philadelphia, and they in turn also asked for oaths of allegiance from the city's population. And when they leave in 1778 and the revolutionary government returns, a third series of oaths are issued. This is a traumatic, turbulent time. Imagine being in a city where your allegiance is questioned, but then by extension, so is your personal safety, so is that of your family, and so is that of your property. So during this period, the American Philosophical Society is not meeting on a regular basis. Indeed, it's really not until after the American Revolution ends that it begins its rebirth as a society. In 1785, they began gathering funds to design and then build their first permanent home, which opens in 1789.
So, Philosophical Hall has opened 1789. Benjamin Franklin was around to see this new building for his society. I wonder if you could tell us how the society got to where it is today. Obviously, the museum is now in Philosophical Hall. So how did that all come about?
Philosophical Hall was the only building of the American Philosophical Society until the mid-20th century. And so at that point, it was operating primarily as our historic library and archive and reading room. And some different additions were built on the back to try to accommodate that in the 19th century. But in the 1950s, we had outgrown that space. And so we negotiated with the National Park Service, which owns all of the land that's in and around Independence Hall, to reconstruct a building that is now where our current library hall is located. This is a good story, in the 18th century, in 1789, when Philosophical Hall opened, it was one of two buildings that were new to the neighborhood. Philosophical Hall, and then right across the street, 5th Street, was Library Hall, which then was the Library Company of Philadelphia. So that was the first permanent home for the Library Company. So in the 1950s, we negotiated to rebuild that structure. And the one real requirement from the Park Service is that we make it look exactly like it did in 1789. So when you walk by Philosophical Hall and Library Hall now, that is the vantage point that you would have seen in the late 18th century.
And what are some of the highlights of your collection now that you are open to the public museum?
We have a few that I will mention. Some of them are on display this year for our 2026 exhibition. So we have one of Thomas Jefferson's, they were called fair copies, or his handwritten drafts of the Declaration of Independence. This particular copy he sent to Richard Lee, who was a delegate to the Continental Congress. In fact, Richard Lee is the one who had initially suggested the Declaration needed to be written, but he was unable to do it himself, and so Jefferson stepped in. The draft is great because it is not only obviously in Jefferson's own hand, but includes marginalia of comments or suggestions that Congress wanted to make. Jefferson was not happy about any of them. He didn't think anything needed to be changed about the declarations, but it's a nice snapshot of trying to figure out how the drafting process went. We also have on display this year our 1776 first printing of the Declaration of Independence by John Dunlap. It was done on July 4th, right after the Declaration was ratified by the Congress. And we also have a version that was done 2 weeks later. The differences between these two versions are important. The initial version from July 4th was done on paper, and it's one of 26 known copies available around the world. 21 are in institutions like ours, and then 5 are in private hands. The second version that Dunlap did was on vellum, which is a much heavier substrate, and it's also slightly larger. It is the only known copy of the Declaration on vellum anywhere in the world. And so we don't actually know what that one is worth. If I'm going to move ahead off the Declaration for just a moment, 2 other objects worth mentioning are, we have Benjamin Franklin's copy of the Constitution. So all members of the Constitutional Convention got their own copies. This is Franklin's copy where he writes in the marginalia what he thinks about various elements of the Constitution and how it was developed. And then finally, because the American Philosophical Society was headed by Thomas Jefferson at the time that he was president of the United States, it is also the repository for the journals of Meriwether Lewis and William Clark and their expedition to the Pacific. And those are remarkable documents. When I told friends and family that I was taking a position here, they said, what kinds of things does the APS have? And I said, well, we have declarations of independence. And they said, that's nice. Other places do. And I said, we have Ben Franklin's Constitution. And they said, that's nice. Other places have constitutions. And I said, we have the journals of Lewis and Clark. And they couldn't say anything to that because nobody else has the journals of Lewis and Clark, which are remarkable documents and accompanied by a huge collection of botanical specimens that are on deposit at the Academy of Natural Sciences, run by Drexel University here in Philadelphia. So those are some of our highlights, just some.
And you mentioned that those will be out during this year's celebrations. How long are you planning to have them on display in case anyone is hoping to make a visit to Philadelphia this year?
Sure. The exhibition opened in mid-April, and it will be on view through the first week in January of 2027.
Very nice. And very quickly, going back to the Declaration, and obviously Benjamin Franklin, do we know how much of the final version of the Declaration Benjamin Franklin had a say in?
We do. One of the other documents that is on display in the 2026 exhibition is a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to Benjamin Franklin, where he says, Dr. Franklin, if you have time, I'm paraphrasing, but just barely, if you have time, I hope with your enlarged view on this matter that you would have an opportunity to review this document one more time before I set it before the Congress tomorrow. So in essence, Benjamin Franklin had the last reading of Thomas Jefferson's Declaration before he sent it to the Congress for ratification.
Very nice. And that, I presume, is also part of the 2026 exhibition. Not something you could see normally. Are these all coming out especially for this year?
These documents are all on display in 2026. And we usually limit the amount of time any particular document will be on view because of exposure to light. Any exposure to light has a degrading effect on archival material. But in this instance, to celebrate the 250th, we did bring what we think of as some of our really preeminent materials from the archive together in the gallery, where they are on display together for the first time in the same place.
Wow. So definitely, if you can make it to Philadelphia, check that out. Are you doing anything else to celebrate America 250? Is there anything for July that people could potentially put in their diaries?
So in addition to the exhibition, which I should have mentioned is entitled These Truths, the Declarations of Independence, declarations plural because there's more than one, we've had a range of activities planned for the year. July, I will warn people, is going to be very busy in Philadelphia. In addition to everything associated with the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, FIFA, in its wisdom, has decided to hold its activities in, you call it football, we call it soccer here in Philadelphia. And almost every professional conference that I know of is meeting in Philadelphia this year. So Philadelphia is packed. But our major highlights for the year, I will mention three. The first actually began last year in 2025. Well, in reality, it started 5 years ago. 5 years ago, we began digitizing materials related to Philadelphia during the Revolutionary period. Right now, it spans 1765 to 1804. We have about a dozen partners, and we have about 6,000 pages of material. The goal is to digitize everything that was coming through or created in Philadelphia during those years to try to capture a full snapshot. And it's called the Revolutionary City, a Portal to Our Nation's Founding. Our goal is to have this extend, of course, well beyond 2026. This is supposed to be a teaching tool and a research tool for decades to come. We also, though, hosted a conference in June. June 4 to 6 is a 2.5-day conference that looked at the Declaration from a variety of perspectives. And it's part of a 3-part conference tour for the year. The first in March of 2026 was held in conjunction with the University of Hong Kong and the University of Chicago in Hong Kong, called Global 1776. June is called America's 1776, and that's held here in Philadelphia. And then October will be Europe's American Revolution, which is in Paris. So, and then finally, we would not be a true scientific society if we did not focus on science. And so our Center for the History of Science has been doing a multi-year series called America's Scientific Revolutionaries that include videos and lectures and podcasts. And all of that material is available on the APS website. So I encourage your viewers to take a look.
All right. Well, we're heading towards the end of today's episode, but I always like to finish by asking what you think Franklin would make of your organization today if he were to come back and get a glimpse of where his projects have ended up. So in other words, how do you feel Franklin would react to seeing the APS doing what it is today and what it is hoping to do in the future as well?
I'd like to think that Franklin would be very pleased with what he sees. Aspects of the organization would remain familiar to him. We still have our elected members. They meet twice a year, not as often as his compatriots did, but at least twice a year, the members convene here in Philadelphia to share ideas and share research. I think he'd be very pleased with our grant and fellowship program. We have about 50 fellows a year who come to the APS to use our materials either for a month or for longer periods of time, up to a year or 2 years. But we also have a grant program that sends researchers around the world. I think he would love that. We have over 300 grantees a year that are sent literally to all four corners of the earth. All 7 continents have been funded by an APS grant. And I think that would be entirely in line with his vision of perpetuating interest in science in all of its many aspects. There are some aspects of the society that I think might surprise him, but hopefully pleasantly so. Do I think that he would be surprised we have a Center for the History of Science? Do I think he'd be surprised that we have a Center for Early American History? Yeah, because in his time, it wasn't history. It was just what they were living through. And so what we have as the core of our collections are the materials that they left us. So they become important, but wouldn't necessarily have been in his time. I think he would have been interested in the Center for Native American and Indigenous Research. That is one of our most active centers in the contemporary sense. They do a lot with indigenous contemporary indigenous communities around researching local cultures, local languages, contemporary languages, or language reclamation, helping to bring languages that may be waning or even lost back into existence. I think he would find that fascinating.
Michelle McDonald, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you on today's podcast. Thank you very much for your time. And we've learned so much about the American Philosophical Society and Franklin's role in 18th century Philadelphia.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
That was Michelle McDonald from the American Philosophical Society. Join me next time as we round off our time in America, talking to the Library Company of Philadelphia to discuss Franklin the printer before we move to London for the final episodes of this series. Until then, thank you for listening and goodbye.